Well, what's up, guys? Ben here, bringing you another video today. We're going to continue our series here on season recaps for the teams that did not qualify for COD Champs. Today, we're going to talk about the Minnesota RØKKR. We're going to walk through their journey this year, where I think they struggled, especially in respawn, and kind of parlay that and talk about what they should prioritize in the offseason, how to handle some of the sort of roster stats of a few of their players, and make a few suggestions on some possible players to pick up. Let's dive in. I think the best way to kind of describe Minnesota's season, it's really another season of missed opportunities, which has been sort of a theme, I think, the last couple of years. You know, last year, their season ended up pretty good. Really struggled for most of the season. They brought in Standy, started to really turn around a respawn, and they had that real magical run at the last major, winning probably the best grand finals thing I've ever seen. I've never seen a best-of-9 comeback. It's the first time we've ever seen it, to be honest, but was a good showing from them, and they placed well at champs, so the momentum was good. They kept their team roster together going into the season. A Major Maniac, Standy, Priest, and Attached. They didn't have the greatest of starts to the beginning of the season, so we get kind of jump right in sort of Major 1 qualifiers. They do end up kind of being in this pack of teams that go 2 and 3. Taking a look at kind of the series results, they did have wins against, LAG, and they actually had a surprise win against Optic Texas, who were really struggling at the beginning of that major. But they ended up losing to Atlanta Face in a 3-0 fashion. They lost to a strong London team, and they lost to Seattle as well. So all things considered for Minnesota, at that point, unfortunately, they ended up on the wrong side of these tiebreakers. If we take a look, this is kind of a theme throughout the season. If you ended up 2 and 3, you're pretty much at the mercy of your map record and who you lost to. And Minnesota won just over 40% of their maps. So in terms of sort of the whole head-to-head map tiebreaker thingamabob, it didn't really work out in their favor. We take a look at the Major 1 bracket here, and because of that, Minnesota had to start in losers. They actually had a decent showing in their first match against LAD, really like thorough 3-0 on their part, but they ran into a very good LA Thieves team, and at that point we're top 8. I wouldn't say it's the worst of major cycles. You definitely want to try and get some points early, but they weren't dead last. They had something to build on. That being said, this is where things started to go a little bit south for this version of this roster. Again, another major qualifier cycle. They're on 2 and 3. They lost to Toronto. They lost to a very mediocre New York team, as well as a Boston team who had a pretty good showing in Major 1. So, not surprising. They've also been very good online, so not really surprising that result there. They did have victories against Paris in a Game 5 and LA Thieves in a Game 5. Neither super convincing. This is sort of a motif for Minnesota, especially at the end of the season. They were sort of grinding out these wins, but they came in Game 5. So map record again once again actually worse than the last major split, and therefore again they're sitting on the wrong side of the tiebreaker cut, which was tough for them because they pull up to Major 2, and this is their home major, running out of Minnesota, a lot of momentum, and it really sucks to start in losers. They get a really unlucky draw. They're sitting at the top of the losers brackets. They would play the loser of Seattle and Texas was, I think, highly favored to potentially win that matchup, and they get 3-0 stomped by Seattle. Very surprising upset on day 1. So a really tough draw for Minnesota. They did their best in that series, but it wasn't enough against a strong Texas team, who end up finishing that event top 6, and Minnesota's out. They get top 12. Really tough start to the season at that point. They're really kind of starting to get behind the ball in points. So at that point, Minnesota decides, okay, we're playing a little bit too slow. Yes, we're good in S&D, but the respawn's not there. We're going to go ahead and make some changes. So they go ahead and they bring in Havoc, who was rumored to join the New York team at some point, and with Kiz and yada yada. But they drop Major Maniac. He goes to the bench. They go ahead and they pick up Havoc, and they pull up with some practice to the Prime event in Columbus, and they don't have a great showing there. If we take a look at the map records here, they lost to Optic Texas at that event, and they lost to Florida. And if you lose to both of your CDL teams in this format, you were pretty much shocked. They had a strong win against a pretty decent Toronto EU team, but all things considered, not really enough to get out of groups. They finished sort of 9th, 12th. Not your best showing at an exhibition event, to be fair. There weren't CDL points at the line, but it would have been nice as a momentum builder to go ahead and get into groups. I think they're really feeling the pressure at this point. You're getting to the Major 3 cycle. It's the last 2 events. You really haven't won much on land, so points-wise, you're really struggling. And to be fair, there was an opportunity because a lot of the other teams that are sort of around the cut line, LAG, New York wasn't playing particularly hot at that point. Thieves is kind of up and down. Florida's kind of up and down. So Paris, obviously, we talked about in the last video. It's not like they were lighting the world on fire. So opportunity for Minnesota. If you could put together really good Major 3, Major 4, you're definitely making champs. So they actually start out the Major 3 cycle super hot. They actually end up getting first seed and play 3 really good weeks of Call of Duty. They looked like a completely different team at that point. And it's not like they beat some scrub teams in this run. They beat Atlanta Face 3-0. Very surprising victory. They beat Florida, LAG, who had by the way, won Major 2 at that point, so they were a pretty good team. They beat the other LA team, LA Thieves. That was a sort of payback for some of the earlier losses against Thieves in the season, and they grind out a 3-2 victory against a good Toronto team. So great start for Minnesota, 5-0. That's 50 CDL points. You're feeling good going into Major 3, but they pulled to Major 3, and they only were able to squeak out top 8. Really disappointing. They lose to a strong Thieves team in winners round 1. It was already going to be sort of a tough series. They had to really grind it out. Although Minnesota's the better S&D team, was definitely a surprise Game 5 loss. They were able to beat Boston on day 2, who were really struggling at the time, but they pulled up on Saturday morning and didn't have the best times against Toronto. That was a quick series. And for Minnesota, for all of the work you did in the 3 weeks prior to Major 3, you pulled up to Toronto and your weekend was over on Saturday morning with not a lot of CDL points to show for it. We get to Major 4, and they're basically on the cut line at this point. Like, they really need a really good performance going into Major 4. New York was really surging at that point. People were pretty high on them. Thieves had a really good showing on land, so you felt like they were doing pretty good. Toronto had played really good at their Major. They were also kind of floating around the cut line. You always expect Florida to place good at land, so the pressure is really on Minnesota to have a good showing. And they actually had a pretty good online showing in Major 3. They beat Optic, they beat Paris, they beat Seattle. They did lose to London, who, to be fair, ended up getting the top seed in Major 4 qualifiers, and they got 3-0'd by Florida, but it's Florida, like, you never know sometimes. So, okay, you get 30 CDL points. You're keeping pace with teams like Florida and Toronto and a little bit with New York, who are behind you, Boston, who's sort of still on the cut line. And you're like, okay, now if we go to Major 4, we get a good result, we have an opportunity to go ahead and qualify for champs. And candidly, once again, they get to land, and it's just not the result you want. To be fair, once again, tough draw. You're playing a New York team at home in front of a crazy crowd. They were chanting all sorts of things at their players. They lose another winners bracket, Game 5 loss, this one to the home team. They get dropped down to losers, and it's a tough draw, man. The loser of that series, regardless coming to the event, was going to have to play Optic Texas, who did not have a great showing online with bringing Illy back. And again, another Game 5 heartbreak for Minnesota. And pretty much that was that. Their season, their upside and their possibility to get the champs was sort of chalked at that point. They didn't have enough points, so it's over and done with. There's sort of a recurring theme with Minnesota the last 2 years, and it's this, and I think it's sort of the key thing that they need to work on going into next season with their roster. They've been a great S&D team. Like, if we take a look at their S&D stats from this season, they ended up being 22-17, better than 55 win percentage. That puts them even above a team like FaZe in terms of win percentage in S&D. Shout out IOUTurtle for the stock. And I actually have their stats from last year in S&D. And once again, 30-24, top 3 S&D team. So the S&D prowess with it was there, but where they really struggled the last few years is in hardpoint. So this year they ended up being 20-27, just bottom 3. The only teams that were worse than them was Toronto Ultra, kind of a similar team with a similar sort of win condition, and Paris, who obviously we talked about last video. And last year was mostly the same as well. If we take a look at their hardpoint stats, 28-41, just over 40 win percent. The only teams that were worse were, again, Paris, not very good. A really struggling London team last year, and LAG, obviously, we will touch on their roster a little bit later, but that was maybe one of the worst respawn rosters ever assembled in the CDL history. So I think that, to me, is the big priority for RØKKR in this offseason. You got to figure out, look, we are nasty at S&D. We know that with our personnel and the coaching and our system that we play, that we know we can be really good at search. But if you can't win more than half of your hard points, and no one's saying you need to be this crazy hardpoint winning team, like, look at overall hardpoint stats this year. FaZe is best, but they've only won 60%. Like, if you can be in one of these teams that's winning about 50% of your hardpoints, you have 2 of those in a series. You've got to control. If you feel good about winning like 45 to 50% of your respawns and you're good at S&D, even if your series are going to Game 5, you've got confidence you're going to be able to close it out. Whereas now with Minnesota, look, by the end of the season, the only hardpoint that they were really comfortable in, the way Vito's will work, was Bocage, but there's still pressure to go ahead and win at least 2 S&Ds, and that wasn't a gimme either against some of these series. One more thing in regards to hardpoint, and this will kind of segue into sort of the personnel conversation. If you sort of watch their VOD from the last 2 years, they like to play a very structured set of hardpoint, and I personally am never a big fan of that. I think there was a time and a place back in older CODs where you could have pulled that off. I think now, if you look at like all the top hardpoint teams, they all play very aggressive, hit all time when possible with 1 or 2 guys, pinch from all sides, really fast, aggressive hardpoint to constantly keep the team on the back heel. And I don't think a passive style of hardpoint is going to get you the win conditions that you want to be like consistently good team in the league. And if you look at the personnel they have, it didn't really fit that style necessarily. I felt like their old version of their roster from when they started this season with Major Maniac, like, you had 2 fast players in Havoc and Priesta, and you had 2 slow players in Patch and Major Maniac. And the only game where that really worked was Modern Warfare. You looked at the Dallas team, and Clay and Krim played really slow, but they had 3 absolutely fast-paced subs in front of them, and Shotzi, Ender and Kyler, and you get away with it in that game, but every other game, man, everybody's got to be on the same page. So I think the big question for me in Minnesota, and I'm going to highlight this like in yellow so you guys can kind of see, is really the situation around Dylan Attach. Probably their best player by the end of the season. They had, at this point, when they made the switch to bring in Havoc, they moved Dylan to more of a full-time AR role, which personally I thought for years he should have been playing anyway. The problem now is he's not got a team option. He is a full free agent at the end of the season, and if you're Minnesota, your kind of roster decisions, if Dylan stays or goes, are like completely different. I think that they're going to have a pretty serious conversation with Dylan if they want him to stay. They're going to have to offer him a pretty decent contract. I think also they're going to have to let Dylan sort of have some direction over the roster. We call this like giving a player the keys to the roster. I know that doesn't necessarily mean that they have unilateral decisions on what happens, because Brian and Looney are experienced players. They used to be pros. Like, they know how to build rosters, but I think in order to keep Dylan, they're going to have to kind of cede some leverage here because they don't really have any. If we take a look at the rest of their roster, they did pick up Fame at the end of the season. Interesting pickup. We'll see if they keep him on as a sub for next season. Priest is a free agent. I don't think the Preston fit really worked for them, to be candid. He joined over from Atlanta FaZe when him and Major Maniac dropped off that team after their tough champs loss versus Dallas, and they had some limited success in Minnesota, but from what I've heard around Preston's camp, I think his time in Minnesota is kind of over. I don't think it was a really great fit for him by the end, and I expect him probably be elsewhere. Like, if we take a look at Minnesota's stats overall this season, obviously we talked about how good Dylan's been. Havoc's come in and has been a really good player, and they have a team option on him, so I expect regardless if Dylan stays or go, they would be really dumb not to keep Havoc around. But the other players were definitely not a good fit. Preston obviously struggled. I think Stanley's sort of my big kind of conversation piece here. He had a really good first season. He came in and totally changed their hard point. He was super aggressive. This season almost felt like he wasn't really sure what to do on the map. He looked uncomfortable. He wasn't in sync with his team. I wonder how much that's like a system fit thing and how much of it is like an IQ sort of learning how to play structured COD thing. Yes, second year players are sometimes going to struggle, but this one was a little bit unexpected based on his form in year one. And a tough thing for him is he's a free agent. So from a leverage position, you know, having a season where you're sub and you're dropping around like a 0.95 as opposed to closer to a 1, the Minnesota team's going to think, well, maybe there are better options out there, and Stanley might be looking for a new team in the offseason. So, okay, let's talk. What should Minnesota do? So I think priority one is you got to keep Dylan. I think your roster positions here, if you can't keep Dylan, what you're looking at in terms of these free agents, and I should specify, by the way, since the last time I did one of these videos, if you scroll down, I actually reached out to a source on the Toronto Ultra team because I got a lead. And it actually turns out that the whole team is signed new deals in 2021. So none of those players are currently free agents, but I will say in the Toronto situation, it's possible they may not pick up the options on all these guys. So the free agent list is like even smaller now. It went from being 13 to now essentially 10 players, and that includes 3 players on Minnesota, so it's really 7 at that point. So they've got to keep Dylan. If they can't keep Dylan, it's going to be one of those years where you're going to be thinking about, well, maybe we got to kind of think more of a 2-year project and trying a quick rebuild. If you keep Dylan, I assume you're keeping Havoc as well. I think they fit together well, both in their ability in S&D and speed, and then you kind of let those two guys sort of find other players around. I kind of look at the free agent list here, and I could see maybe like a Skies being a really good fit. That's assuming that Dylan wants to run flex, but assuming that Dylan wants to be more of a main AR type, maybe you kind of go after Big Wake. Maybe Dylan and Clay team again. We'll see. You know, they've had some past success in games, but that was a long time ago. Afro might be another interesting option for this team if they want to splash the cash. He's a really dynamic player, could pair well with Havoc and Dylan, and I kind of like sort of the mindset on that team. You kind of get a veteran to round that out, and I feel pretty good about your offseason chances. If they're not able to keep Dylan, this is where things get a little bit interesting, because you're essentially left with Fame and Havoc at that point, unless you're going to run it back with either Priest or a Standy. So I think then you're looking at some of these amateur players potentially as sort of a look-see here. A couple of these players may not be a good fit. I mean, these two, you know, have had runs in before, and it didn't really go well in year one, so I don't expect either of these two players to be someone that they would entertain necessarily. But you've got some interesting options. Vickel's an interesting option from a intangible standpoint. Obviously, Mohawk's been pretty good in challenges for a number of years and is ready for a call-up. I really like Brezzy. Obviously, RØKKR had their own academy team where they picked up a bunch of Spanish players. Lucky was probably the best player on that team. Can I see him coming over to U.S. to play? Sure. There's always a question of, is English good? Are they going to be able to get a visa? Like, a lot of unknowns there. And we take a look at some of these other teams and players that may not necessarily get their option picked up. I'll be curious to see what happens with Zero over at London Royal Ravens. He seems to be a good personality fit, probably with Attach, but, you know, love trade, but isn't always the most consistent player at times, and Minnesota might be looking for someone that's definitely going to show up on land because they've really struggled on those land victories the last couple of years. You can kind of see what happens with the Toronto situation. Obviously, like as I mentioned earlier, all these players are on a team option, but they may not pick up all option on these 6 guys, so we'll see what happens. To me, Nick Classic might be a really interesting option if they sort of end up with a situation where you're, okay, you got attach Havoc, you pick up another free agent player, and then you need sort of a gap filler kind of hedge. Nick might be a really good fit. Another option, guys, and he did have one run back with Minnesota in the first year of the CDL. I could maybe see a world where Asim goes back, maybe Gunless. These are 2 players that, you know, LAG situation, we'll get to it in the video later, is a little bit interesting. I could see those 2 players potentially being on the radar. Paris's roster is interesting as potential targets for Minnesota, especially Tom Gravity and the 2 subs. That might be a good kind of culture fit for them on what they're trying to do. And I think for the rest of the teams, it's really going to depend on sort of team option pickups. I think, look, my overall final thoughts on Minnesota are this. The last 2 years have shown that as a respawn team, they've really struggled. And yes, they do have a chip. They did put together one weekend on land where their hardpoint was really good last year. Their S&D was obviously world class at that point. They were able to capture the dub. But outside of that, and say like the 3 weeks this year during Major 3 qualifiers where they were playing well, it hasn't been the best Call of Duty, especially on land. And yes, you want to have this culture of structured Call of Duty being a really good S&D team. But in this kind of environment in the CDL with these 12 squads and how deep there are, you got to be able to win some hard points. And that's been where they've really struggled the last 2 years. So my expectation for this Minnesota team in the offseason is they're going to try to address that and become a better overall respawn team, keep that sort of S&D mindset. And if they can do that, I can see them becoming a real contender next year in the CDL. If they can't, it's going to be another one of those seasons where maybe they put it together for a weekend or 2, but they're going to end up being sort of a top 8, top 10 team. And with champs being a 8-team only tournament, you know, once again, they may be on the cut line to potentially not make it to champs. Well, guys, that'll do it for this video. It was a fun conversation about Minnesota. Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think some of those players make sense? Are there other options you think they should explore? I'll have the link to this contract status tracker I showed in the description if you're curious to see the status of players. I'll constantly keep updating it as I get information on some of the stats of these players. If you like this video, please leave a like. If you want to keep following my content, I'd appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. I'll be posting new videos pretty much every day from now until champs and then after champs. So we're going to keep doing these recap videos on all these teams, especially the teams that didn't qualify for champs. We'll keep doing those videos before champs. And after champs, I'm going to break down all the 8 teams at champs, how they did and what they should do in the offseason. We'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you so much.